anybody here work in any kind of medical field or anything with doctors or nurses or no? Okay. All right. Too bad. Well, I'll keep note. Just kidding. This is a book I wrote about a doctor in Cincinnati who grew a ministry. Two stories, really. He developed a process that literally has become kind of built into the medical infrastructure for controlling infection. And it's literally programmed into the Epic system if you're in a hospital and they pull up the computer system, and was phenomenally successful. And then God called him to start treating neglected tropical diseases in Africa using a similar process. And this was something that nonprofits had poured billions of dollars into and barely moved the needle. And this little organization has found a way to really do something dramatic. So if that interests you, I have a book to give away, and you can come up and claim it. So I'm going to put it down here, and a bold soul will come up. And so I'm not pushing my own books on people. I have a little bit of a issue with that. So, all right, so we're going to talk about conflict. And I, prepared this and everything, and there's a passage of scripture I want to spend some time in. It happens to be in the book of James, and I walk out into the lobby, and I realize, oh, they're actually going through James at the moment. So I sidled up to Andrew, and I'm like, have you preached on James 4 recently? And he's like, not yet. And I'm like, okay, all right. Well, they're probably going to hear this twice then, because James 4 talks about, how we handle conflict. So we'll get to that in just a second. But just a couple thoughts at the beginning. I was just talking in the other section about how, as God's children, those created in his image, we are kind of uniquely positioned to see the frustration that sin causes in the world. Because it does. Like, let's just admit it. The world is frustrating, right? Things, despite what Apple says, not everything just works, right? And there's all sorts of challenges and frustrations and difficulties and the pull and tug, and it's just, that's what we do. We manage, we cope, we just deal with all of this kind of stuff. And so there's frustration that comes with it, and I'll make the case, or I made the case, that sometimes that frustration is actually God pointing us to something he wants us to solve. But sometimes it just boils over, and especially when we're working with people and frustration boils over, it gets ugly. Right? It's conflict. And how do you respond to that? So there was a Harvard Business Review study that said some managers spend up to 40% of their time managing conflict. That's why nobody wants to be in management, right? Because that's what you do. I'm one of those weird people where I'm actually strangely drawn to conflict, but we can talk about that later. So, sometimes conflict, like there is a creative tension that can be good. Like you need, when you're on a team, you need some openness and you need some trust, and that's good, that's great. But most of the time, conflict can be really negative. So I was meeting with a group, there's a couple of groups of business leaders that I meet with on a regular basis, and we were talking about conflict in one of them. And a guy, he owns his own business, and he just said, I have never been screamed at in my life like I was screamed at last week. And we're like, whoa, tell us that story. And he owns a construction company, and he was working with a subcontractor, and they've worked with this guy before, and something had changed on the bid, and they were working through it, and suddenly this guy lost it. Like, just lost it. And so this guy is sitting there as business owner, and there's somebody else in the room, and he's kind of going through, like, is this going to get dangerous? Okay, it doesn't seem like it's going to get dangerous. Okay, is this affecting customers? Like, who else knows that this is going on? Obviously, anybody in earshot knew it was going on, right? Kind of figuring out, like, how serious a problem is this? And it was just like this guy just blew up. And all of a sudden, what started out as a meeting to just kind of work through some bids became something very ugly and something very messy. And so as Christians, we have not only a sensitivity to how people react in the frustration of the world, we actually have a call. We actually have a commission to be light and to be a source of truth and encouragement and to demonstrate God's love. And so conflict gives us a unique opportunity, because our culture, and this is very true in business, our culture is, we'll just treat that as a bug, and we're going to reboot, and everything will go along just fine. We're just going to kind of pretend like it didn't happen. Sometimes something may get to the level where it's like, we're going to go down the hall and talk to HR, right? That's Andrew's session. He's in the other room right now. But usually it's just kind of just sort of swept under the rug. And in doing so, we're actually passing by a huge opportunity that God has given that I want to open our eyes a little bit to. So if you have a Bible and you want to open it to James chapter 4, I want to just pick out a couple of things in this passage that help us kind of direct our response to conflict a little bit. So if you just think, where does conflict come from? Well, it tells us right at the beginning of James 4. It says, what causes quarrels and fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet, but do not obtain. You fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, right? So he's saying what happens is you think you are deserving of something, and that gets taken away. Or you want something, and that gets taken away. Now, we can think of all kinds of extreme scenarios. Let's just bring this back to the workplace, right? You are hired to do a job, and you get paid to do that job. Okay, fine. But with every job, and more in this day and age, there's supposed to be some kind of recognition, right? There's supposed to be some kind of sense of belonging and inclusion because you do your job. If you're a good employee, you deserve to share in kind of the rewards and the benefits of what that means. And a lot of times, something happens, and because we don't have all of the resources or everything that we need, that feels contested. Somebody else wants it. You had the idea, and yet somebody else speaks up in the meeting and gets credit for it. And you're sitting there like, that was my idea. They really should have said that was my idea. They didn't say that was my idea. And your mind just kind of starts to go, right? There's some places where this can become very hostile. There's some companies that actually set up sales structure so that people compete in these ways, right? It's not healthy, but it exists. And so if we have these passions and desires, people get angry and fight when that gets crossed. But it's interesting that he says, you do not have because you do not ask. There's something behind there, right? Obviously, we don't just get whatever we ask for. God, please, please, please let me win that big sales contract, right? Or please, please, please let me, get that promotion, right? That's not necessarily what happens, and so that's not what he's telling us. Instead, I think what he means is if what you want is in line with God's purpose, then you can trust that God will provide. That's what Jesus told us in the Lord's Prayer, right? Not my will, yours be done. That was Jesus' example. Give us on earth what you have in heaven. Give us our daily bread. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. That's framing our view of the world in what God has told us he is accomplishing. And then we can either trust that God will provide, and when he doesn't, we can be, okay, well, I can be patient, because if God has a purpose, he's not going to fail in that, and I can let that come to pass. It doesn't feel like it's all about me. And so instead of just avoiding it and calming it down, there's an opportunity there for us to bring something different into the conversation. Now, it's interesting in this passage because James is talking to Christians, because he goes on to say, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity of God? Whoever wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. So he's saying if as a Christian you're operating in this way, like you've lost your path, you've lost your way here. This is not what God wants for you, and he's calling us to account. When we're dealing with non-believers in our work context, they are lost, right? They don't have something else. This is it for them. And so they fight and they quarrel and they cause conflict, or they scheme, or they undermine, or they're passive aggressive, or all of these other ways that conflict happens but below the surface, not out in the open. But his promise to us as his children comes in verse 6, because he says, but he gives us more grace. Oh, so God is willing to add something to the equation. Right? There's a certain amount of recognition to go around, right? There's a certain amount of reward or bonus at the end of the year, or all of these limited resources that we have. And that's what we fight and quarrel over. But James says, hold on. God is willing to give more grace. He's willing to add something to the equation that changes it. Now, for the unbeliever, they're like, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? But as a Christian, we should say, oh, God's grace, that's what I really need. That's what my soul really longs for. I might see these other things as God's grace. I might see the way that he provides for me through my job, or the recognition that I get that lets me have a platform to share my beliefs, right? All of these things could be God's grace. But if God is going to give me his grace, then I know that I have what I need, and I don't have to fight other people for it. And so we need to be able to kind of look for the bigger picture, because what God notices is that he says God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That is different, right? How many times is it the person that is willing to toot their own horn or willing to draw attention to themselves that gets the reward in the world system? And, we struggle with this. Well, am I just being a doormat? Like, do I just let people run over me because I'm a Christian? I'm supposed to be a nice person, right? That's not how God sees it. God actually will actively oppose the proud. And you know what happens when God's opposing you? The conflict goes up, right? The fighting goes up. The demands, the feeling like I have to get this for myself goes up and up and up. Whereas when we can be humble and say, okay, you know what? It's not about me. If God wants to work in this situation, he's going to have to do it in some way that I can't accomplish, because I can't do that, right? I can't match that person. That would be wrong for me. So now God is giving us his grace, and he's letting us, he notices us in our humility. And here's what I think happens in that moment. When we see God notice us, that gives us the space to notice other people. Right? So I'll go back to this situation with this business leader who got screamed at. So we're talking this through in this group, right? And we're kind of asking questions and kind of trying to unpack it a little bit. And now this has happened over a week ago, almost a week ago, when we were talking about it. And all of a sudden this guy says, it's really interesting, because I remember now, while he was screaming at me, he said, I hate it when you do this. And we're all like, what's the this? He said, I don't know. I don't know what I did. But apparently I've been doing something that has been building up this frustration inside of this guy. And that's when it broke loose. It wasn't just in that moment. They've been working together for a while, and there's something that this owner was doing completely unbeknownst to him that was sparking this frustration and this annoyance and aggravation. And finally, this guy blew up in the meeting. So what he has right there is an opening, because he's got to work with this guy again, right? So he could do the thing where it's like, not gonna, hey man, how you doing? Like never happened. Or he could say, hey, I noticed during the meeting, the infamous meeting, right? You said you hate it when I do this. What is it that I'm doing? You see the humility that shows? Like, I don't want to be doing something that's upsetting you. That's counterproductive to why we're here. So I'm going to ask. I clearly don't see it. So help me out here. But in that moment, God gave him an entry point. Those words, I noticed, can be so powerful. I've sat in meetings with clients and team members and other things, and you can feel the tension start to rise. Right? And I'll start to pray. I'm like, God, help me notice what's going on. Help me see what's going on. We had a situation where somebody got really upset in a meeting, and I was like, oh, God, what's going on here? And he just reminded me, like, you saw that person start to try to talk 2 or 3 times, and somebody else always cut them off. Well, I would get frustrated. Right? I mean, I would probably have a hard time not insisting that people hear me. So I can go to that person afterwards and say, hey, I noticed, and I did this. I said, I noticed that you had tried to kind of speak up a couple times and got talked over. And finally, I think when you spoke, you were probably a little more forceful than you intended. And you're like, yeah, I'm sorry. I said, how can I help you when you're ready to speak up? How can I help you do that? I said, what if I took the conversation and handed it to you? Would that help? And she's like, that would be such a help. She said, I have these ideas and my words haven't all come together yet. And I kind of get tongue-tied, but there's something important I need to say. And I said, okay, I'll do that. I will create an opportunity for you to speak up. And it's helped, right? So that ability to say, okay, God is giving me grace in this moment. Now I can step back and I can look for how God is working, and then I can give grace. I don't have to come out of this like, I got what I wanted. I got my point across. No, God's working. How can he use me to then see that in other people's lives? So James goes on, and he gives us some ideas here of how that actually works. So in verse 7, he says, submit yourself to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Okay, we've just got to keep stuff under control. If you have an anger or a frustration that you're having a hard time controlling, that's something you need help with. That's something you need to start figuring out, okay, what's going on outside, maybe getting somebody else's help to say, okay, that can't be running my life. I can't do that, right? But then I can go on from there and say, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. There's that promise of grace. If I will practice this process of saying, God, how can I notice your grace in this situation? Boy, that was a really uncomfortable meeting. God, what did I miss where you were showing your grace? How did I see that? And if we can practice this away from these tense situations, we're going to be better at spotting them when we actually get in there. There's a real temptation to just kind of fold and go with sort of like laughing away the awkwardness or, kind of playing on the joke like, oh, okay, I guess this is a big deal to you. There's a lot of things we can do that might be funny in the moment, but are really demeaning, right? There's no room for that here. In verse 9, he says, be wretched and mourn, weep, let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. I don't think that he means like walk around like a really crabby person, but take on the frustration of that person. Here's somebody else created in the image of God who feels strongly about something that they have to contribute and it's not getting heard. That should bother us. We shouldn't be okay with that. And we should be willing to extend ourselves and say, you know what, I'm going to just create a little bit of room here because I think so-and-so has something to say and I would like to hear it. Can we do that? Right? Instead of doing the easy thing and kind of, being the person that cracks the joke or whatever that looks like in that situation. And then he comes back to humility. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will exalt you. Right? Instead of grabbing the thing or fighting for the thing that you think is going to exalt you, wait until God exalts you. Because I'll tell you this, if you grab it for yourself, somebody else is going to grab it from you. If God gives it to you, no one's taking that away. No one is taking that away. And even if it's with that sense that you are my child, I put you in that room today for my purpose, and you obeyed me, that is something you will carry with you for a long time. So God calls us to be peacemakers, right? My friend Mike in this situation, I don't think I told you his name earlier. His name's Mike, okay. This business owner in this situation, he kind of let it play out. This guy all of a sudden realized, I think, what he was doing and shut down. And so this conversation continued with the other guy. And then this guy started to kind of chime back in. And what my friend said in that moment was, he was like, oh, you're back. Good, because we need you on this. And you see what he did in that moment? Instead of just being like, we're just going to pretend like that didn't happen, he acknowledged it. Like, okay, you went away, somebody else came in for a few minutes, but you're back now. And you're valued. You belong. You're part of what we're doing, and that's what's most important. Such a simple thing to do. And it hasn't solved everything, I mean, believe me, but at least it's created a way that maybe a future conversation can happen, maybe a little bit of relationship building can happen, and who knows what could come from that. Because if this guy is blowing up in one meeting, he's probably blowing up in other meetings. He's probably losing opportunities in friendships and relationships as a result. And so someone who's willing to take that and say, okay, but I noticed, I'm interested in you, I value what you have to bring, can just be such a breath of fresh air, can be such a light and hope in what can be an otherwise dark and contested world. So, conflict is opportunities, right? Our own frustration gives us opportunities to see things that God may want us to solve. Conflict gives us opportunities to get involved in other people's lives. Thank you.